Well, he lay there wishing that he had spent more on the mattress in the guest bedroom. But then, at that time, it never crossed his mind that he'd be spending his nights in that bedroom rather than the one down the hallway. The path that had brought them to this point was pretty clear, right? The drinking, the nagging, the debt, the flirting, taking one another for granted. The path was pretty clear, but he still could not wrap his mind around how they got to this point. They had been so much in love at the start, and now they're living in this Cold War standoff. They're living in a wilderness. As she wiped the steam from the bathroom mirror, her thoughts drifted to the day ahead of her, and she couldn't help but think that the person in the mirror didn't look like her anymore. The person in the mirror, this lady, she was worn out. She looked haggard, bags under her eyes. What happened to that girl that had such big dreams? What happened to the girl that was going to have her own shop by this time? What happened to the girl who was on her way to great things in life? This person in the mirror looks stuck, trapped, no way out in sight. Just like every other day, she's going to put on her uniform. She's going to work a double shift, serving the customer favorites, and she's going to make just enough in tips to get by, barely making the ends meet. And she's going to finish the day feeling like she's about to go under for the last time. She's living in a wilderness. He tried to be strong. He really wanted to be strong, but still a few tears spilled down his cheeks on the way home. His coach was a really nice guy, really great coach. He always had good things to say to his parents when he dropped him off. He'd talk about how good he was in practice or how great he did in the game, and his parents would smile, and that felt really good. But it wasn't the same as having his dad on the sidelines at the game. Sometimes during the games, he would look over at the sidelines and he would pick out a dad and pretend that that was his dad on the sideline, that his dad was there cheering for him and clapping for him and looking proud when he made a great play, because that's what his dad used to do. That's who his dad was before the accident. He didn't really know any details. Dad got hurt at work. Some safety harness broke, and now Dad is broken. He's always in pain. Can't do hardly any of the things he used to do. Their love for one another, that's as strong as ever. Right? That might be an even stronger bond than before the accident, but neither one of them knows how to be father and son anymore. They're living in a wilderness. Last week, Pastor Darrell introduced our series called God with Us. And in this series, we want to see how God is with us in the worst times of life. That God is with us in the storms and in the valleys and in the wildernesses that we experience it. And so we thought it would be helpful this morning to start by just differentiating these different categories of life, these experiences of life that we encounter. And so we're going to be talking over the next few weeks about storms and valleys and wildernesses in life. And you can think of a storm in the sense of an isolated event or circumstance. These are all hard or negative things in life, right? But a storm is an isolated event or circumstance. A valley would be more of a brief, difficult season, all right? It lasts longer than a storm. And a wilderness lasts even longer than a valley and usually has a degree of despair to it. A valley is often discouraging, but a wilderness has despair involved with it, and it's just a deeper level. And how we experience these different seasons of life, along with all the good ones, right? There's a lot of good, happy, lovely seasons of life, all right? But we're really focusing on these hard ones. How we experience in them is different from person to person and from occasion to occasion. It's not set in stone. It hardly ever happens the same way. Sometimes, a lot of times, it will start with some kind of storm, some kind of event or circumstance that comes into your life that can lead you into a valley. And it becomes that brief, difficult season. And if that season drags on or deepens, then it leads you into a wilderness experience, which is just a different level, a different depth of hardship. Sometimes that storm will bypass the valley altogether and just dump you right into a wilderness. And you're like, this is going to be a long process here that we're going to be working through. Other times, there's no storm whatsoever, right? There is not an event or circumstance that puts you in the valley or the wilderness. You just show up there, and you're in that hard place. And you're like, I don't even understand how or why we got here. And of course, sometimes a storm can come and pass without any other effect. And you're on to, whatever is coming next. But a storm doesn't have to lead into a valley or a wilderness, although it often does. And so how we experience these hard categories or seasons of life changes and varies every time and for every person. But here's what we want to know, that in every place we find ourselves, good, bad, difficult, despairing, every place we find ourselves, God is with us. Today, we're looking at that wilderness experience to see, how is God with us there? How do we see God when we're in that wilderness experience? The wilderness is a place of desolation and loneliness and longing and fear and emptiness. It's a place of scarcity where you have to fight just to survive and exist, just to get through the day. The wilderness is a place that we rightfully avoid if at all possible, right? None of us are willingly going into the wilderness. No, we're dragged, kicking and screaming, or else we look up and we find ourselves in this desolation, this place of wilderness, and we think, I don't know how I got here, and I don't know a way out of this place. The wilderness is a place where good people, good things, good dreams go to die. It's a place of loneliness and desolation, unless something could turn even that desolate place into an oasis, into a place of life. Matthew 1:23 tells us that Jesus is Immanuel, God with us. That Jesus is the incarnation, the physical presence of God with mankind. And the fact that God came in the physical presence of Jesus and remains with us in his Holy Spirit has changed everything, and everything about how we experience life. Jesus, is that thing, that only thing that can change the wilderness into an oasis. And God with us means that even the desolate land of the wilderness can be fertile soil. That life can come from what should cause death. In this sense, our greatest fears and challenges, needs, our greatest pains, those things that take us into a wilderness experience and season, they become gifts to us when they drive us into God's presence, into his arms, and into dependence on him. We hate them, but they can become gifts when they drive us into his arms and into dependence on him. What a hope-filled, life-reviving proposition that is, that I am in this wilderness place, a place I hate, but I do not have to wither and die here. That I can thrive even if I'm stuck in this wilderness for a while longer. Now, I always appreciate when I can see things play out in someone else's life. Like I understand, I get the premise, but I want you to go through it first so I can watch it all happen, and then I can learn from the things you do right and the things you do wrong, and I'll be better off for it, right? I want that to happen. Well, we have just that opportunity this morning because we're going to study a moment, an experience in the life of Elijah. If you're unfamiliar with Elijah, he was one of the more significant prophets in ancient Israel. And God did amazing things in and through Elijah as he served God as a prophet. You would think that a person who is doing such amazing, incredible things for God, being used for God in such powerful ways, that person would always be full of the joy and the power of God's Spirit, right? He'd always be on cloud nine. Surely someone like Elijah would never experience the wilderness. It makes sense, but it's wrong. Elijah knew exactly what it was like to be stuck in the wilderness. The kind of wilderness where you literally want to die. So look at 1 Kings chapter 19 with me. At this point in the history of the nation of Israel, the kingdom is split into northern and southern nations. The northern kingdom is called Israel still. The southern kingdom is called Judah. All right, and verse 1 of chapter 19 introduces a few individuals and some situations, some circumstances that help us understand Elijah's journey into the wilderness. And so let's look at that, verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So there's obviously some backstory that's going on here. Ahab was king in Israel. That's the northern kingdom. Ahab is king of Israel, and he is known, biblically recorded as the most wicked king of Israel. In God's eyes, he was the worst, most wicked king that they had. All right, that's Ahab. Jezebel was his wife. She is known as even worse than Ahab. More wicked than Ahab. So you've got some very wicked people here in Jezebel and Ahab. Jezebel's greatest sin or offense was her role as the patron, supporter of the cult that worshiped the false god of Baal. She led the people. She promoted Baal worship in the northern kingdom of Israel and led the people in there. She set up temples and altars to Baal and encouraged worship, which included all kinds of terrible things like child sacrifice and such. And so she's leading the nation of Israel, God's people, to worship Baal rather than the God of heaven. And so this verse tells us that Ahab, who's a bad guy, tells Jezebel, who's an even worse person, everything Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with the sword. All right, it's talking about things that were recorded in chapter 18. Elijah has a big showdown with the prophets of Baal. And the short version is Elijah and the God of heaven win, and Elijah has all the prophets of Baal killed. All right, and so Ahab tells Jezebel this. And obviously this infuriates Jezebel. So you have Elijah, who's coming off his greatest success, if you will, most fantastic success in his career as a prophet. His adrenaline has got to be pumping overtime. He's on cloud 9, and then he gets hit by a bus. Look at verse 2. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." She's telling Elijah, "I have now made your slow, painful death my greatest priority and purpose and joy in life." Now for Elijah, he's coming off his greatest success, most fantastic work on behalf of God and through God's Spirit. And now he's confronted by his most powerful enemy. And her reputation is more than enough to back up this threat. And so Elijah does what any sane person would do. He ran away. And in doing so, he enters into this wilderness, emotionally, spiritually, and then eventually physically. Look at verse 3. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. Elijah had been in the city of Jezreel, where Ahab and Jezebel was. And when he was threatened by Jezebel, he starts running and he heads all the way down to Beersheba, which is in the southern kingdom of Judah. All right, so he's out of country. He's out of their country. He's trying to get away from Jezebel's political reach and power. But he knows that he is not outside of her reach to have him killed. And so he's running away. Now, we don't know his state of mind other than the fact that he was afraid when he left Jezreel. But somewhere along the journey, we're going to see that a lot of other thoughts and emotions entered into his heart and mind. Things like sadness, doubt, deep despair. And with every step he took from Jezreel, he was entering deeper into that wilderness, desolate place in his heart and in his mind. And then when he reaches Beersheba, he leaves his servant, right? And this would have been his right-hand man, someone that had gone through all of the events with him and was there with him in each of these things. And he leaves him behind, and he heads off alone into the wilderness. Not figuratively, like literally he goes off into the wilderness. And he finds a broom bush or a broom tree. And you can see one there. You can see how desolate it is. These don't grow in lush garden areas. They grow in desolation. And he finds this broom bush, and he crawls up under the shade, and he prays a most authentic prayer to God. He says, "Let me die. I can't do this anymore, God. I can't bear this burden. I cannot walk this path anymore." And he goes to sleep. And I can't help but imagine that maybe Elijah was hoping he would never wake up again. God, I'm going to go to sleep. And just take me while I'm sleeping. Don't let me wake up again. Elijah's experience in the wilderness teaches us some very important things about experiencing that wilderness place. First of all, it tells us that the wilderness can show up at any time. The wilderness can enter into our lives. We can find ourselves in the wilderness at any time. Sometimes it's a slow walk into the wilderness, right? We can see it coming from a mile away. We know it's coming at us, but there's nothing we can do about it. Maybe it's a condition that will slowly disable your mind and body or a loved one's mind and body. You know it's coming, but you can't stop it. Maybe it's a slow decline and eventual failure of the business or career that you have spent so many years investing in. You can see it coming, but you can't stop it. Other times we're cruising along, things may be going really great, and then out of nowhere, boom, something blows up, and we're catapulted into that wilderness. Maybe it's a sudden stroke or medical issue that drastically changes your life. Maybe it's factors outside of your control that derail the plans that you've worked so hard and were so excited about for your life. See, it's not a matter of if, but when. When will we find ourselves in the wilderness? It's part of our human experience. When will we find ourselves in that wilderness? Because it can happen at any time. And I'm curious, I'm wondering how many here today might be living in the wilderness this very moment. Elijah also shows us that in the wilderness, isolation is our enemy. Isolation is our enemy. We aren't told why Elijah would leave his trusted companion behind in Beersheba, but we're soon going to see that Elijah was sinking into deep despair, and he felt all alone. And when we're in that state of mind, our natural response is to put up walls, to insulate ourselves from the people in the world around us, right? We want to protect ourselves. We want to keep everything at arm's length so that we can deal with what we're thinking and what we're feeling and what's going on. But that isolation will never turn the wilderness into an oasis. That isolation will never bring life. It'll only further perpetuate the wilderness that we're experiencing. Isolation is our enemy. And then lastly, Elijah shows us that in the wilderness, authentic conversation with God is essential. It is powerful. It is so important. Elijah was raw and open with God. He said, "Let me die." Now, Elijah wasn't going to take his life, right? That's never the answer, never the solution. But Elijah was saying, "God, will you take me away? Please, give me escape." I wonder how many times you've wanted to say something that bold, that harsh, that raw and unfiltered to God, but you felt like, I can't say that. That's going to make God mad. That's going to make things worse. I can't admit that. But if we allow it, living in the wilderness has the ability to strip away the pretense of strength and sufficiency of ourselves. Living in the wilderness has the ability to nurture in us a depth of authenticity that we cannot find anywhere else. As we say these kinds of things to God. just find it so interesting that the people, as we read in the Bible, the people who were closest to God, who had the most unique and powerful connection with God, especially in the Old Testament, people like Moses, who sat face to face with God in the tent, people like King David, like Elijah here, they said the most raw, the most unfiltered, the most authentic things right to God's face. Losing that pretense of sufficiency, gaining that dependence, that depth of authenticity with God is essential for turning wilderness into oasis, for turning death into life. Because in that process, our greatest needs, our greatest challenges, pains and fears and hurts, those things that landed us in the wilderness become the gift that have caused us to depend on God as we've been real and authentic with him. Well, the story goes on, and we discover the most encouraging and inspiring response from God. Elijah's there. He's in the wilderness, right? Physically and figuratively. He's crying out to God, just take my life. Let this be over. And then he's sleeping. In verse 5, God responds. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he's traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. Now, I said that God responded to Elijah rather than God showed up, and that was intentional. You see, this is our whole point. God is with us. God did not need to show up for Elijah in that moment or any other moment because God was already there with him. God does not need to show up for you and I in whatever circumstance we find ourselves because God is already there with us. And when we cry out to God, he responds because he is there with us. And then notice the gentle, kind response that he shows to Elijah. There were no corrections. There were no questions. There was no sense of, come on, Elijah, we've been through so much. I expected more out of you. What does he tell him? He says, here, eat something. And Elijah rolls over, and there's some fresh baked bread, a jug of crisp, clean water. Now, I don't care who you are or how gluten intolerant you may be, the smell of fresh baked bread is amazing. And that is what God lays out for Elijah. And then he allows him to go back to sleep, and then he wakes him again and feeds him again. And God is meeting Elijah's most basic needs in this moment, in this place of desolation. God is replenishing his body as well as his spirit. You see, when we find ourselves in this desperate wilderness place and we're crying out to God, he responds and he will replenish us. He responds and he will replenish us. If your wilderness is a tough parenting season, maybe your replenishment is a good day here or there. Or maybe it's a kind word from a stranger saying, hey, you're doing a great job when you feel like an utter failure. If your wilderness is a prolonged unemployment, maybe your replenishment from God is an unexpected check in the mail, or a friend or small group member dropping off a home-cooked meal out of the blue for you. But God responds, and he knows what our needs are, and he will respond to meet those needs, to replenish our bodies as well as our souls and our spirits. This thought of God's replenishment makes me think of our year-end giving project, Water for Life. Right now, there are 80,000, give or take, refugees living in a camp in western Uganda. And they are there. They fled their homes because of war or persecution, that if they stayed home, they were going to die. So they had to leave everything, and they're in this refugee camp in Uganda. And the living standards there are substandard, to say the least. There is no source of clean water in the camp. And so what you find are lines and lines of jugs, and often children waiting there for the delivery of clean water for days. Cholera is a problem because people are resorting to drinking unclean water, and cholera is killing people in the camp. When we learned about this earlier in the year, we knew right away, we're like, we've got to do something about this. We don't know what yet, but we've got to do something about this. We can't let this happen and just sit by. And one of our mission partners, Progressive Missions, is working in Uganda already. And so they began to have conversations with the government there and say, hey, what can we do? And the government has granted a piece of land in the refugee camp for us, where our dream, our desire is first to put a well in this camp, where there won't be kids waiting for days with their jugs there for the water truck to show up. But they will have a source of clean water. One well is not going to cover the whole camp, but it's what we can do, right? And we're going to do what we can do. And so we're going to build this well on this a piece of land where the kids won't have to wait. Cholera will not be as prevalent because people will have clean water to drink. And like God did with Elijah, we have the chance to meet a pressing, physical, life-giving need of clean water. But God did not stop there with Elijah. He went on. Now, he did not transport Elijah, right? He didn't just pick him up and lift him out of that wilderness place. When Elijah woke up after eating, he was still under that same broom bush in the same desolate place. But God responded and met his pressing physical needs so that he could then meet his deep emotional and spiritual needs. And after feeding Elijah, after letting him rest, he tells Elijah to go to Mount Horeb. Now, in the ancient mind, mountains were special places. Because in the ancient mind, in their way of thinking, when you're closer to the skies, you're closer to the gods. So being on top of a mountain, that is where you'd be closer to the gods. And so they would often set up temples and altars on top of mountains, on high places. And in the time of the Exodus, God brought the Israelites from Egypt to Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai. And that is where they saw the glory of God on display in terrifying ways, right? And that is where Moses met with God and came away with the 10 Commandments and the laws. Now, during Elijah's time, God's presence was in the temple in Jerusalem. But God says, Elijah, go to Mount Sinai, go to Mount Horeb. It's an older, a more intimate, a more private place to meet with God. The second part of our Water for Life initiative or project dovetails with this as well, because right now there is a local church meeting near the refugee camp under a big tree. You can see them sitting there. They're under this big tree for some shade. And they have such a heart to reach people in this refugee camp, but they have so few resources. They don't even have a place other than this tree. And so, again, with permission, we have the dream and the desire to not only build and install a well to give clean water, but to build a church building for this church there, so that there is a local church in the refugee camp. And they already collect portions of the crops that they grow so that they can help feed refugees who arrive with nothing. And this church building, it's going to be very simple by our standards, but this church building will give them a place to store those crops so that they can help feed people who have nothing. And it'll give them a place for the people of the camp to come and meet with God and to hear the good news of Jesus. So not only will they find water on this piece of land, they'll find the living water of Jesus through his church there. This is our desire. This is our hope this month. And so will you join us? Will you give to Water for Life in the month of December? There's a special envelope in your bulletin this morning. They'll be available all month long. You can also designate giving online to Water of Life. And will you join us to help make a life-changing difference in this refugee camp in Uganda, to provide not only clean water, but the living water of Jesus through this local church. We hope that you will join us. We've got big dreams. If you want information, like amounts and this and that, there's info pages at the info counter following the service. You're welcome to grab one of those and join us in that. But when Elijah reaches Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, he's gone into the cave, he's rested there. God asks him a question. He comes to him, and I love God's question here in verse 9. It says, the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? I love that. When my son gets a little wound up, when he's upset about something and he's angry or hurt, I'll sometimes sit down and call him over, sit on my lap, and I'll put my arms around him and I'll say, what's going on, buddy? What's going on? It's a tender invitation. He's all wound up and angry, but it's a tender invitation for him to tell me what's bothering him. This is God's tender invitation to Elijah. What are you doing? What's going on, buddy? Tell me what's bothering you. And Elijah opens up to God in verse 10, and he replied to God. He says, listen, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty, in case you didn't notice. He says, the Israelites, they've rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They put the prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. God listens to him, hears him out, and he says, all right, Elijah, step outside. I want to show you something. The Lord is about to pass by. Now, God's presence has always been there. That's the whole point. God is with Elijah. But God is about to make his presence known. He's about to make his presence felt and seen. All right? And so God passes by. And when he exerts his presence, when he makes it known, the very foundations of the earth are rattled. It says that a powerful wind tears through the mountain, lifting up boulders and stones and dashing them to pebbles on the earth. And that's followed by an earthquake. And you can just imagine this whole mountain shaking and rattling and the earth tearing open. And that's followed by a fire. This fire that rips through the mountain, burning everything. Elijah's got to be terrified at what's happening. This is what God is capable of. Now remember, God's not exactly doing anything here. He's not shaking the mountain. He's just making himself known and felt and seen in this moment. This is the wake, the impact of the unveiled presence of God in our world. Now Elijah wanted to see this. And God is showing him what Elijah wanted to see. Elijah was essentially telling God, listen, you got to do something here, God. I've been faithful to you. I need you to show up and do something. I've got enemies that want to kill me. You need to help me. And God shows Elijah what he's capable of. He shows Elijah that, listen, I could take their whole fortress, their whole city, and just demolish it. I could open up the earth and swallow up every soldier of your enemies. I could take a fire and burn through their town so there wouldn't even be ashes left behind. I could do all that. But that is not usually God's way. And that was not God's way with Elijah either. After this awe-inspiring glimpse of unimaginable power, God whispers to Elijah. Look at verse 12. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? There's that tender invitation again. What's going on, buddy? What's bothering you? God had shown his great power. He had shown Elijah what he's capable of. This is what I can do just by showing up. But where is God? Where is he? He's close enough to whisper to Elijah. He's close enough to whisper to us. In essence, God is saying, Elijah, you want to know what I'm going to do about all this? I'm going to be right here beside you. I'm going to be with you. And then in verses 15 through 18, God maps out a plan for Elijah. He shows Elijah the way forward. You see, Elijah had cried out to God in the wilderness. Elijah had moved towards God, closer to God, in dependence on him. And when we do that, God will show us the way forward. He will show us the way forward. It might still take a long time to get out of the wilderness, but he will show us the way forward. For Elijah, God addresses every fear and every problem that Elijah was facing. He tells Elijah to anoint certain leaders of the surrounding areas. And God says, I'm going to use those leaders to destroy your enemies. And God is whispering to Elijah, I'm going to keep you safe. I'm going to protect you. He tells Elijah to anoint Elisha as his successor, his apprentice. He's whispering to Elijah, you're not alone in this. You're not alone. And he tells Elijah that there is a remnant, that there are thousands of people that Elijah's not even aware of who have not worshiped Baal. They have not abandoned God. And God is telling Elijah, he's whispering, you have not failed. Not everyone has abandoned me. You have not failed. More than the earth bashing, ground tearing, fire blasting power of God, Elijah needed that close enough to whisper presence of God. If you've been reading our Christmas devotional, you've read story after story from people right here among us who have experienced God's close enough to whisper presence in their wilderness, whatever that source might be. And it has been inspiring, and I thank you for all the contributors to that. We so appreciate letting us into your life to see what God has done for you. You see, our greatest needs, our greatest challenges, our greatest fears, our greatest pains, those parts of life that we hate become gifts to us when they drive us into God's arms and drive us to depend on Him. Maybe you're here this morning and you're living in a wilderness place. Whatever it is that drove you into the wilderness can be a source of death, or it can become a source of life that turns the wilderness into an unexpected oasis. And if we respond like Elijah did, if we follow his example, then we can experience God's goodness and God's greatness and God's life even in a place of pain and suffering. Let's cry out to God with raw, unfiltered authenticity. Let's say the hardest things we want to say to God, and at the same time, moving towards Him. If we're saying those hard things to God as we run away, that's a problem. But if we're moving towards God, we can say whatever we want to Him. We can be unfiltered with Him. And let's receive His provision, His replenishment, whatever it may be. Sometimes we're in the habit of saying, that's not what I wanted, God. That's not enough. Let's accept what He gives us. Let's accept the fact that He's probably not going to just pick us up out of the wilderness today and transport us into better times. It might last a bit longer or a lot longer. But we know that when we cry out to God in that wilderness, when we move towards Him and depend on Him, He will show us the way forward. Whether it takes a week, a month, a year, however long, God will show us the way forward. And if you're in that wilderness place today, for whatever reason, and you don't have to be in a wilderness place, I hope you're not, but if you are, I would love to have the opportunity to pray with you and pray over you. The band is going to lead us in a song in just a moment. And you have an opportunity, an invitation to come stand in this empty space up front. And as we sing this song, we want to cry out to God like Elijah did under that bush. We can cry out collectively, and as you come and stand, you can stand here, you can sing if you want to. You can just cry out in your heart to God. You can just stand here like Elijah just sat under the bush. I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to stand here and hope God notices me, because He will. And then I'll pray over us and with you. So as the band begins, let's stand, let's sing together, and you are invited to come and cry out to God.